On the morning of May 4th, 1831, a 24-year-old New Yorker named Abner Hutton stood at the edge of a stand of beech and maple on his 80-acre claim in Cass County, Michigan, set a steel-headed felling axe against the trunk of a white ash about 14 inches in diameter, and began swinging. The tree came down in about 20 minutes. Abner marked a 20-foot section with a charcoal stick and cut the butt end off flush. That section would become the bottom log of the south wall of the cabin he and his wife Rebecca were going to live in for the next 11 years. It was the first of the 70 trees he was going to cut before the cabin was finished. He finished in July. Rebecca and their infant daughter moved in at the end of the month. The cabin was 16 feet wide and 20 feet long, had a single room, a loft under the rafters for sleeping, a fireplace at the north end built of fieldstone, a plank door, one small window, and a roof of clapboards split from oak blocks. It weighed, at the time it was finished, approximately 12 tons. Every pound of that weight, except the iron of the hinges and the latch and the glass of the window, had come out of the standing forest within 200 yards of the building site. The Huttons had arrived in Cass County in April of 1831 from Chautauqua County, New York, after a 6-week journey by wagon and canal boat and Lake Erie steamer and wagon again, with all of their possessions in a single ox cart and about $80 in cash in a leather pouch Rebecca had sewn inside the lining of her dress. They had bought their 80 acres from the United States Land Office at Kalamazoo for $1.25 an acre, cash, and had walked out to the parcel on foot with a surveyor's rough map in hand. The land was heavily wooded in beech, maple, oak, ash, hickory, basswood, and elm, with a small creek running across the southwest corner and a level rise of about 2 acres near the creek that Abner had picked out on his first visit as the cabin site. The rise was dry, the creek was close for water, and the trees on the rise itself were not as dense as the surrounding forest, which meant the first phase of clearing would be easier there than anywhere else on the parcel. The arithmetic of how many trees a single cabin consumed was not something the Huttons or any of their neighbors had ever calculated on paper. It was knowledge they carried in the way a carpenter carries the sense of how many nails are in a keg. Abner knew by looking at a stand of timber how many logs he could get out of it, and he knew by looking at a finished cabin how many trees had gone into it, and the numbers matched up in his head without any conscious counting. The number for a standard cabin of the size he was planning, built in May of 1831 in Cass County, Michigan, with the tools and the methods available to him, was approximately 70 trees. The number is approximate because some trees were larger and yielded 2 logs, while others were smaller and yielded 1, and because some trees were culled for their branches or their bark rather than for their main trunks. But 70 is the figure that shows up in several surviving frontier account books from the 1820s and 1830s, when a man was keeping track of what he had cut, and it is consistent with the total volume of timber required for a one-room log house of 16 by 20 feet with a clapboard roof and a stone hearth and a puncheon floor. The breakdown of the 70 trees ran roughly as follows. 30 trees went into the walls of the cabin, because a 16 by 20 structure with walls 8 feet high took approximately 28 logs, laid in a simple saddle notch construction, with a few extra logs cut in case of splits or imperfect notches. These wall logs had to be as straight as possible, between 12 and 14 inches in diameter, and at least 22 feet long for the long walls and 18 feet long for the short ones to allow for notch overhang. Abner cut these wall logs first, selected them for straightness, and stacked them on skids near the building site to dry for about 2 weeks while he worked on the rest of the material. 8 trees went into the roof system. The ridgepole was a single long straight log about 22 feet long and 12 inches in diameter, cut from a tall basswood on the south edge of the parcel. The 2 wall plates running along the tops of the long walls were slightly smaller. 4 purlins running parallel to the ridgepole between it and the wall plates were smaller still. The roof covering itself was made of clapboards, which were thin, flat sections of wood split from short blocks of oak, using a froe and a maul. A single oak tree of the right diameter, about 18 inches through, would yield enough clapboards for a strip of roof about 4 feet wide and 16 feet long. Abner needed about 6 oak trees for the clapboards alone. 15 trees went into the floor. Log cabins of the first generation in the Old Northwest did not have plank floors because planks required a sawmill, and no sawmill was within reach of a new claim in most cases. Instead, the floors were made of puncheons, which were split halves of small logs laid flat side up across sleeper logs that ran across the short dimension of the cabin. A puncheon was made by splitting a log about 12 inches in diameter lengthwise with wedges, then dressing the flat face with an adze to make it roughly level. A 16 by 20 cabin needed about 40 puncheons to cover the floor, a plus 4 or 5 sleeper logs underneath them. The puncheons came from smaller trees than the wall logs, about 8 to 10 inches in diameter, and a single tree of that size would yield 2 puncheons if the tree was tall enough. 15 trees was the rough count for the floor material. 5 trees went into the door, the window frame, the loft floor, and the internal furniture. The door was made of heavy oak planks split from a large oak block and held together with wooden pegs and iron hinges. The window frame was made of smaller sections of the same oak. The loft floor was made of thinner puncheons laid across the rafters. The internal furniture of the first summer, which consisted of a table, 2 benches, and a bed frame, was made by Abner on the spot from the scraps and offcuts of the framing material. He supplemented by 2 or 3 additional small trees cut specifically for the purpose. A bed frame made of rough-hewn oak with rope lacing for the mattress support was the standard first bed of a frontier household, and it took a surprising amount of wood to build one because the corner posts were thick and the side rails were heavy, and nothing was wasted on thin milled lumber that did not exist. 12 trees went into the chimney and the hearth. The chimney of a frontier log cabin was not a wood-burning object, but its construction consumed wood anyway. The framework of the chimney, before the stones were laid up inside it, was a wooden scaffolding that held the field stones in place while the lime mortar was drying. The scaffolding was taken apart after the mortar set, and the stone chimney stood on its own. But the wood of the scaffolding was usually cut fresh and was usually wasted or repurposed for firewood after the chimney was finished. The hearth itself, which was the flat stone platform in front of the fireplace, required a timber-framed bed of laid logs beneath the stones to provide a stable base, because the uneven ground of a new cabin site could not be relied upon to hold flat stones without movement. The 12-tree figure for the chimney includes the scaffolding, the hearth bed, and the firewood consumed in burning off brush, and in fueling the small cooking fire Abner and Rebecca kept going during the building, weeks before the chimney itself was finished. The remaining tree count, bringing the total to 70, came from the miscellaneous uses that were impossible to anticipate, but showed up every day. Wedges for splitting, dalles pegs for joinery, handles for the axe and the maul and the hammer when the originals broke, spare rungs for the ladder that Abner had to build to reach the roof, skids for rolling the wall logs into position, lever poles for lifting the heavier logs onto the walls when they were too high to reach, braces for temporary supports, scaffolding for the clapboarding, stakes for marking, chocks for wedging. By the time the cabin was finished and the scrap wood was piled up at the edge of the clearing, Abner had cut approximately 70 trees of various sizes from the 2 acres around the cabin site, and approximately a third of the mass of that wood was in the finished building, while the other 2/3 was in the piled scrap, the burned brush, the stumps, and the waste. The tools he used to cut and shape the 70 trees were astonishingly few. A felling axe, about 4 pounds, with a hickory handle he had made himself in New York the winter before. A broad axe, about 6 pounds, for squaring and hewing. A froe, for splitting clapboards. A maul, a wooden club he had made from a beetroot ball on the first day at the site. 2 iron wedges for splitting logs lengthwise, a draw knife, a hand saw about 2 feet long, a 2-inch auger for boring peg holes, a plumb bob on a length of string, and a tri-square made of 2 pieces of scrap oak joined at a right angle. That was it. No nails except the few he had brought from New York in his tool chest. No measured lumber except what he made himself from the standing trees in front of him. No power of any kind except his own body and the leverage of a few simple tools and a wooden pole when the weight of a log exceeded what he could lift alone. The weight was the part that modern readers often underestimate. A single green wall log, 14 inches in diameter and 22 feet long, weighed between 600 and 800 pounds, depending on the species. A man working alone could not lift such a log onto the top of a wall that was already 6 feet high. Abner used a pair of skid poles leaned against the wall as an inclined plane and rolled each log up the skids using a lever and a rope, with Rebecca holding the free end of the rope to prevent the log from rolling back. The highest logs, which had to be raised 8 feet above the ground, took nearly an hour each to position. The notches at the corners were cut only after the log was in approximate position, because the exact length and the exact notch depth depended on how the log settled against the one below it. A saddle notch in a well-built cabin was tight enough to hold the chinking in without any daylight showing through. Chinking was a mixture of clay, moss, and chopped grass that was pressed into the gaps between logs after the walls were complete, and the quality of the chinking work determined whether the cabin was warm or cold in winter. Rebecca worked alongside Abner for most of the building process. She was 21, strong enough to handle the rope and the lever, experienced with an axe from her own upbringing in Chautauqua County, and responsible for the daily camp chores of cooking and washing and caring for their infant daughter, Elizabeth, who had been born in March of the same year, and who spent most of the building weeks in a wooden cradle under a canvas awning at the edge of the clearing. Rebecca's hands were as blistered as Abner's by the end of the first week. She carried water from the creek, She cooked over an open fire. She chopped the smaller branches into stove-length pieces for the cooking fire and bundled the brush for burning. When a log had to be rolled into position, she held the rope. When a wall section had to be plumbed, she sighted the plumb bob while Abner made the adjustments. The cabin was built by 2 people, not 1, and it could not have been built by 1 in the time available. The time available was the growing season. A cabin built for summer occupancy had to be finished before the corn had to be planted, and a cabin built for winter occupancy had to be finished before the first hard frost, because a family living in a canvas shelter in Michigan in October was a family in trouble. The Hutton schedule was tight. They had to finish the cabin by late July because Abner also had to clear and plant a small corn patch before the end of June, girdle and kill about 4 acres of standing timber for next year's expansion, cut hay for the ox team, and lay in a winter's worth of firewood before September. The building of the cabin was one task among many, not the single focus of the summer, and the 70 trees had to come down in the hours left over between the other tasks. The chinking work took nearly a week after the walls were up. And Abner and Rebecca mixed the clay from the creek bank with chopped grass and a small amount of animal hair they had brought from New York in a sack, and pressed the mixture into every gap between the logs from floor to eaves. The chinking had to be done from both inside and outside, because a gap that was filled on one side but not the other would still let the wind through, and a gap that was filled under dry conditions would shrink and pull away from the logs as the wood dried, requiring a second application a month later. The Huttons re-chinked the cabin twice in the first year, and once a year thereafter for the full 11 years they lived in it. Rebecca usually did the interior chinking because she was smaller and could work more comfortably in the tight corners. Then Abner did the exterior because he could reach the highest gaps without a ladder. The mixture they used held up better than the standard recipe because of the animal hair, which acted as a binder and prevented the clay from cracking in hot weather, and which had been Rebecca's idea based on a plastering technique her grandmother had used in New York. When Elizabeth Hutton was an old woman in the 1890s, living in Grand Rapids with a married daughter, she gave an interview to a local historical society. The historian who took the interview asked her what she remembered of the old cabin in Cass County. Elizabeth said she remembered only fragments, because she had been an infant during its construction and only about 11 when the family moved out of it into a larger frame house. What she remembered was the smell of wood inside the cabin. It had a particular smell of cured oak and dried chinking that she had never encountered in any other building, and the way the floor puncheons creaked in the cold mornings when her father walked across them to light the fire, and a long scar on the ridgepole above her loft bed where her father had slipped with an axe in 1831 during the final fitting, and had opened a gash in the wood that never quite closed, and had always looked to her as a child like a grinning mouth. Abner and Rebecca Hutton lived in the log cabin for 11 years. They added a lean-to against the west wall in 1835 to create a small second room for the growing family, which eventually numbered 6 children. They replaced the cabin with a frame house in 1842 on the same parcel, but about 60 feet east of the original site. The old cabin was left standing and was used as a tool shed and a corn crib for another 20 years, before it was finally pulled down in 1863. The logs from the walls, still sound after 32 years, were sawed into blocks for firewood and were burned in the fireplace of the frame house over the course of the following 2 winters. The clapboards from the roof were salvaged and reused on a shed behind the barn. The stone chimney was pulled down, and the stones were rolled into a pile at the edge of the field, where some of them are still visible today in the overgrown pasture behind a modern farmhouse that stands on roughly the same footprint the frame house occupied in 1842. The 70 trees that had come out of the 2-acre clearing around the cabin site had all been second growth at the time Abner cut them, meaning the forest itself was already recovering from an earlier wave of indigenous fire clearing, and from windfall, and from the slow churn of natural forest succession that had been going on long before the Huttons or any other European settler had arrived. By the time the last of the old cabin logs had been burned in the frame house fireplace in 1864, the cleared area around the former cabin site was already sprouting new saplings of maple and beech and ash, and the forest was beginning the slow process of reclaiming what had been cut. Today, the area is a mix of pasture and second-growth woods, and a careful observer walking across the back 40 of the farm can still find, under the leaf litter and the moss, the stone foundations of the chimney and the rectangular depression in the soil where the puncheon floor used to be. The wood is all gone. The shape of the work is still there. If you want more stories like this one, the full playlist is right here.